Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. In this video we're going to be taking a look at Beelink's latest NUC, their SER7. This is using AMD's latest 7840HS processor. So this is their AMD's APU that is in this tiny little device here. We're going to be going over specs and CPU benchmarks as well as gaming benchmarks and see if this can actually even still run one of the latest hard to run games, Lords of the Fallen, and see how well this performs. And we'll take a look at benches, both average FPS as well as 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. We'll talk about a few different things like how they've done some different stuff. They have this little magnetic puck here for where the DC part actually goes into. This is pretty interesting. I'm kind of iffy on it. Overall, it's fine. I think I would have preferred something that's just like USB-C plugged so that it's a little bit easier and it's not so much of a proprietary port here, but I'm sure there's a lot of reasons why they went in that particular manner. Overall, it's a very robust solution, and even pushing this device to 65 watt, we're going to see that temperature-wise, this thing can handle it. The heatsink solution that they have provided on here, I haven't touched anything. I ran everything at stock, and if we take a look at it just thermally and over a long period of time, if you take a look at this graph here, you can see how long I was actually running this device for at these very high wattages. You can see that the TDP fluctuates as the different scenes are loading in over this many hours benchmark that I had running here. But you can see that temperature-wise, we don't really ever cross over 80 degrees Celsius. More to the point is when we take a look at how long I've been running at that, you'd say, well, all right, even if it can run at 65 watt or 54 watt TV for at length, does the fan get loud? And the answer is no. So I want you to kind of take a look at this. When we take a look at this thermally, you can see that most of the heat we can see from the heatsink itself. But when I get really close to this device, so you can kind of capture the type of sound that it is, it's not very loud at all. So give a listen. Now, right there is what I want to say is generally the fan noise profile that you hear it. And even when it was 2 feet away from me when I was doing most of my tests, I have to say that I didn't really notice the fan all that much. So if you were looking for a device that you can push really hard, being able to get full performance out of that 7840HS CPU and not hear it, Beelink really did an excellent job here. So we're going to be taking a look at specs, see if it can run Lord of the Fallen, as well as all these other types of games that we're going to be doing in the benchmarks here. We're going to take a look at Cinebench as well, see how far we can push the CPU side of things and how well the RAM on this device scales, so we can get a better look at types of bandwidth on the RAM and how that impacts game performance as well. So depending on if you're looking at the Beelink SER7 as a workstation, as a smaller workstation, just to do general computing, that is one avenue that you may be looking at this. But if you're looking to run this with like something with like SteamOS later on down the line, that's something else that I'll be taking a look at later on in another video. We're just going to be looking at this through the lens of running this on Windows at the current moment and get a more holistic idea of how that's going to look from a CPU angle as well as a GPU angle. And that'll kind of take a look at all of it. Up first, we're actually going to take a look at how we're actually going to set this in the BIOS to try to extract the most amount of performance out of this. We're going to go to BIOS first, then we're going to tech specs, then we're going to CPU benchmarks as well as game benchmarks, and then we're going to wrap it all up. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, in this section, we're going to be briefly going over the BIOS settings that are on the Beelink SER7, and specifically with how you're going to try to go ahead and max out the TDP settings. So if you go from the main and go to the advanced tab, go down to AMD CBS, and then from here, you're going to go to SMU common options. Now, these will all be set to auto. I've already set these to manual, and you can see that I set them to 65,000. What that means is that we're telling the system that it runs at 65 watts. So this is where it's going to try to run at all times, and this is better than trying to do it through the Smart Shift option on the bottom, because on the Smart Shift option there's going to be some other variables in there in terms of like PL1, PL2, and PL4 on the AMD side, where it'll kind of fluctuate a little bit more, and using on this side is going to ensure that you're able to hit 65 watt more often. 65 watt is going to be easier to hit in a gaming scenario. Typically with CPU only, you're going to very quickly max out at 54 watt, and that's going to be self-evident when we take a look at the CPU benchmarks. TJ max is 93. This is 93 degrees Celsius. This means this is your thermal throttle point on when the system will disengage trying to push for these wattages and try to save itself. So when it hits 93 degrees Celsius, that's when it'll go away. Now, by default, the Beelink SER7 will be set to manual, and you'll see these in here. Just go ahead and set this to auto because we don't want that to override what we've set here. So doing this, the 65 watt is preferable. Outside of that, any other configuration that you want to touch, you can go ahead and do so. There are some interesting parts in here that Beelink actually makes note of. Let me see if I can find it. Right there, it says, warning, changing PCI device settings may have unwanted side effects. So this is them like kind of just telling you what's going on. Resizable bar is disabled by default, but since we're using integrated graphics, there's no real reason to have that on or off. That does not really matter all that much for us. If you had something like Oculink out, that might matter a little bit more, at which point you can set it to on. And then these are just going to be other configuration stuff that you're going to choose if you want to. At that point, you can go ahead and save and exit, and that is pretty much setting your device for using the max performance possible on the device. All right, so in this part of the review, we're going to be talking about the tech specs on the Beelink SER7. Now, we're going to be going through this kind of like bit by bit, just so that it can have a better idea of what's going on with the system in general. So the processor, the APU that is on the Beelink SER7 is obviously the AMD 7840HS. This is what a lot of people are going to be attracted to, so that's the most important part. We're going to be doing some benchmarks on the CPU side and get a better understanding of how TDP responds on a CPU-only bench, and we'll review that in just a moment. Before we go on any further, the other part that I want to mention is that the network card that is included is the Intel AX200. This is a previous generation network card. Typically, the AX210s are out. This is still a very good Wi-Fi card that is on this device, so it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's a last generation part from a few years ago at this point, so that's something that I wish was a little bit better, but that also corresponds to the Bluetooth on there. Still, it's a sensational part. Like, you're not going to really have much of a problem there. The disk drive that they gave me is this weird drive that we have here. So I have this loaded up over here just so you can see what it is. We'll take a brief look at what this looks like. So we'll go ahead and run a quick test on the SSD itself. And you can see the types of speeds that we get in sequential are relatively good for the no-name SSD that is on the Beelink SER7. And if we do the 4K type of test, we can see the types of result that we're getting. Overall, the SSD isn't that bad here. Our writes are a bit slow, and we can see the reads. Unfortunately, when I take a look at the English setting here, I guess if I did Dutch and go back to English, nothing really changes here, and we're still having this. So that we have read and write, and the writes are not super fantastic, but still fine enough for the included 1TB SSD that they include with the SER7. The other thing that I wanted to show here is that the RAM that was included on my particular model is 32 gigs of RAM. Now, you can actually upgrade this RAM yourself. You can see that the speed right here is 5600 megahertz. So these are sewed-in replaceable, so you can actually change this to 64 gigs if you wanted to. The model that I got is 32 gigs. But more importantly, the frequency of the RAM is good from a CPU perspective. We're actually feeding the CPUs a little bit better here. So if we compare this to other laptop parts like the 7840U, which is going to be using LPDDR5X, we don't have as fast RAM for CPU side. So if we go ahead and just run a benchmark test on the RAM itself, we can take a look at the types of bandwidth that we're going to be getting out of the RAM. And you can see right here that we're getting right around 74 gigabytes a second in raw bandwidth here. This isn't too bad, but this is where LPDDR5X, especially even 6400 megatransfers, will outperform this. We would be getting around 93 gigabytes a second. So 7840U with LPDDR5X, even 6400 megatransfers, is still a little bit better in terms of raw bandwidth to feed that GPU. So this is where it's going to be kind of weird when we take a look at the RAM on this. RAM is better in this situation. The SODIMM parts are better for feeding the CPU rather than for feeding the GPU. So this is still more of a desktop-oriented part, even though we still have pretty decent bandwidth for the RAM. That's just something that I wanted to touch base here. 7500 megatransfers also scores around 93 gigabytes a second, even though it should be faster than that, but everything I tried for 7500 megatransfers is still the same as 6400 megatransfers, so that's something to keep in mind on this particular test. But this test, we're going around 74 gigabytes a second, and that's on the RAM side with 32 gigs of RAM. That is user changeable. The last part of the specs that we should touch base on, and this is a part of the 7840HS itself because the 780M integrated graphics are part of the APU itself. The good thing is that the output port on the SER7 itself does indeed feature HDMI 2.1. Now, right now, I am exporting to my capture card, which does not support HDMI 2.1. So if we were to look at the display itself, you're going to see this 4K 60 Pro. That's my Elgato itself. That's going to my main machine where I'm recording right now. But you can see right here, VRR, this actually will work on a monitor. So I have a LG CX48 that this works on no problem. You can see that you have integer scaling, so you can go ahead and enable integer scaling because anything going out, I would recommend doing that as well. But you can also just use their HyperRX. If you use HyperRX, Radeon Super Resolution is always going to be active. Right now I have it as custom because that is disabled. So the other nice part here is that you can see that in this particular test that I'm going to be doing, all the gaming tests that I'm going to be doing are going to be using the latest AMD driver, which is their 23.10.2 driver set, so the latest from October that's on there. So there are some performance benefits which we are going to be taking a look at Lords of the Fallen as well in these particular tests. But that's it for the generalized tech specs on this device. Following along from the tech specs, let's start taking a look at the CPU benchmarks first. So very quickly here, I just want to show you by default, this power schema on the device is already set to a balanced profile, and that's fine. So what you can see here is that the 7840HS clock limit is going to be set to default. So a default clock limit, meaning that we're not arbitrarily restricting the clock ceiling that the 7840HS can go to. So it is automatically set to default, and the EPP is set to 50. If this is something that you wanted to change, you can set the EPP to 0. So if you wanted to push for CPU far more often, you can. For all intents and purposes, leaving it at 50 is just fine for all the tests you're going to be doing, especially if you're running at 65 watt. You're really not going to have to worry too much about what this setting is at. All right, so here you can see our current package power. So the APU is taking around 10 watts, basically nothing right now when the machine is idle. So this is to be expected. We'll go ahead and enable the multi-core report, and we'll get those scores in just a second while that's running. Go ahead and take a look at the hardware info specs here. And very quickly, you can see that we are indeed starting off at that 65 watt TDP. And if you followed along in this video, you would see that in the BIOS segment, I have already specified for it to run at 65 watt. Now, it won't continuously run at this. There will be a temperature part of this that will engage and go to a 54 watt TDP, which is what it typically wants to run at. If you try to push the CPU too far, doing 65 watt on the CPU side alone is too much for the heatsink solution to handle. Eventually our temps are going to start creeping up, and we will easily fall back down to using around 54 watt on the CPU side. So this is something that I have noticed, and this is something that you should expect to happen, is that we should just gradually go down to be using 54 watt. And by the end of this test, you should see that's happening. So we'll go ahead and skip to that part with that finishing right now. All right, so here you can see that the test is running. We're down at 54 watt now from 65 watt, and you're going to see our benchmark over here on the left-hand side. It's going to go below this 1950X rating because we're now running at 54 watt and no longer hitting 65 watt. So we should just be under this as soon as this finishes. And typically, that's what you're going to expect as your kind of general CPU performance for this device on the 7840HS. So something to keep in mind. We'll see it end right now. And you just saw it right there, just change. And that's basically what you're going to see the CPUs running at, which is very impressive because the 1950X is a 16-core part with hyperthreading enabled, and we're basically achieving the same as the 1950X does inside of 54 watt on an 8-core part. So very, very impressive CPU. This is, for all intents and purposes, a very good workstation CPU in a very small package. We'll let this finish up and see what our overall score is after the another 8 minutes that this has to happen. So we'll catch up to that in just a moment. All right, so this has just finished up, and you can see we have a score of 15,906 points. We are just under the 1950X, which is really, really respectable for the amount of power that we were in there. Again, we started off at 65 watt, at which point we were a little bit above the 1950X. However, almost immediately we went down to 54 watt. So when we take a look at this after the 10-minute test, we're down to 15,906 points, just a bit under what the 1950X does, which is really, really impressive considering that we have 8 less cores and we're using significantly less power into the entire system. The other part that I want you to notice here is that the maximum temperature was 83.4 degrees Celsius. This was only when it was running for that brief moment at 65 watt TDP. Then it almost immediately went down to 54 watt TDP, in which case we were running around 78 degrees Celsius. Now again, this was at stock paste, right? So I haven't touched the heatsink and fan solution. This is what they sent me. So just the stock paste with the stock heatsink fan solution is more than capable of running this machine at its highest TDPs, which is great to see for something so small. The fan is barely audible at all, even when pushing this amount of TDP. So it's overall a really great solution. If you wanted a very small device that had really, really performant CPUs, this is something that you would definitely want to take a look at. Let's go ahead and take a look at gaming benchmarks. Okay, up first, we're going to be taking a look at Batman Arkham Knight. And again, we're going to be taking a look at this through the lens of pushing this device as far as it can possibly go. So we're doing 65 watt TDP. Since we're on mains and there's no battery whatsoever and the heatsink can handle it, there's no real reason to go under that TDP at all. So we should be looking at this through the lens of you're going to be powering this on a device that's going to an external display. You might have this device hooked up in your living room, so you have it as a PC gaming device that is going to be hooked up to your TV. We also have to take a look at this later on in another review if we can get SteamOS running on this device and see how well that works. But just taking a look at it through this particular lens here, we're looking at 1080p max settings on Batman Arkham Knight, and through that we're getting 58 average FPS. We take a bit of a beating on our 1 percentile frame, so we're looking at 43.3 FPS at our 1%, and our 0.2 percentile is 34.5. So this is playable in this particular area, but you might consider dialing down your settings a bit if you wanted to have a more consistent 60 FPS experience. Again, this is from a Windows experience. We take a look at a SteamOS perspective, but there's going to be a follow-up video that has to happen on later on this device. So this is just Batman Arkham Knight. We'll go ahead and take a look at our next game here. All right, so when we're looking at the benchmarks for Cyberpunk 2077, now again, I am outputting to 1080p. However, I am using AMD's FSR 2.1 in performance mode, so it is upscaling from a lower resolution and then doing image reconstruction to make the image appear to be 1080p. It is using the Steam Deck preset, which is a rather pretty high preset to be fair. However, if we take a look at our average FPS, we're looking at around 60 FPS, but our 1 percentile is 39.1 FPS, and our 0.2 percentile is 34.5 FPS. Now, even when we're going through this, you can see that I'm like fluctuating between 45 and 54 watt TDP. Not that going up in wattage is really going to help us all that much in terms of getting better performance by pushing more power into it. Typically, you're going to see massive diminishing returns. We don't really have enough bandwidth on the memory side to really help us out here. So this is what you should generally expect to see on the Windows side. Again, it'll be interesting to see where this goes on the SteamOS side when we take a look at that later on in another video. However, that's what we're looking at for Cyberpunk 2077 on the Beelink SER7 7840HS. Okay, so again, at the settings that I was just using for Doom Eternal, again, doing native 1080p, our average FPS is around 71.5 FPS, 1 percentile at 55.7, and our 0.2 percentile is at 53.6. Obviously, going to like medium settings or even just doing any type of image reconstruction or image upscaling will help you easily get to a consistent FPS. Or if you wanted to push more than 60 FPS, obviously that's something that you can be able to do, but you might have to do with a little bit more upscaling. But more or less, we can Doom Eternal is a game that is going to scale really well with the particular chipset that we have here. So it's just something that I wanted to keep in mind when we take a look at what's running here. And that's it for Doom Eternal. All right, so up next, we're going to be taking a look at God of War, and I'll go ahead and show you my settings that I'm using really quick. So if you take a look at display, on this particular chipset, we are outputting to 1080p. However, the render resolution is 1130 by 636, and that's because I am using the balanced FSR2 preset. So the render resolution is pretty low, but also my graphic settings are also low. I'm doing the low preset here. So this isn't super taxing. Like, we can actually make this really worse for the chipset itself. However, this is going to be one game that'll push any of the AMD's latest APUs to the limit here, so that's something just to keep in mind. All right, again, for God of War and at those settings, our average FPS is 58.8 FPS. Our 1 percentile is not absolutely great. We're looking at 45.5 FPS, and our 0.2 percentile is 42.7 FPS. So this is going to be something where, again, we're going to either run at lower resolutions or we're going to have to make use of like ultra performance on FSR2 because we can't really dial back any of the settings any more than they already are. It'll be interesting again to see where this looks at in SteamOS, because SteamOS with Proton does have some enhancements that are done for God of War specifically, like Cyberpunk is. So it'll be interesting to take a look at this later on. All right, up next, we're going to be taking a look at Returnal. And this game is one game that will actually brutalize the AMD's latest APUs. You can see here that we're only getting 41 FPS. I am already using FSR2 here, so we're only getting 40 FPS in this initial scene that's right here. So I just wanted to quickly show. Also, my resolution is 720p, so I'm upscaling to 720p, which is really low. You can see that the preset I'm using is low, so it's already pretty much as low as it possibly can get. We'll go ahead and run the benchmark. Let me see if I can get that up. So again, running at 720p in all low settings, you can see that our average FPS is 42.3. However, our 1 percentile is 28.1, so barely playable at 30 FPS, even with those extremely low settings. So if you're thinking about something like playing on a bigger screen TV, it's going to look pretty gnarly. And our 0.2 percentile is 25.5 FPS. Again, this was performance FSR2, very low settings, 720p. Returnal is a brutal game on these APUs, and this is something that you're really going to be stretching it as far as you can. And again, we're pushing TDP as far as we can on this device, and even then, we're still not really getting absolutely good performance. So this is one area where I would say that it's just not going to be a game that you're going to look at playing in this particular circumstance. Alright, so here we are taking a look at Lords of the Fallen. This is a new game that came out, and it is brutalizing a lot of machines. So I'm going to go ahead and try to use a 1080p target resolution, which it can upscale to. We are going to be using FSR, so I have that enabled, and the performance preset is what I set for FSR2. If you take a look at graphics, I just went to all low here, and we'll see what happens for Lords of the Fallen. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Alright, so I did two different benchmarks for Lords of the Fallen, and that was the initial onset of when you're playing, and then also the second chapter of the game where the boss comes in. So the average FPS in the first segment was 59.9 FPS, our 1 percentile is 41.5, and a 0.2 percentile is at 35.3. But if we look at the second part, again, we're getting pretty consistent FPS in the first initial segment, even with the big boss fight that we had. The frame rate really didn't deviate all that much, so it's looking like the latest AMD drivers, the 1023.2 drivers, do compensate for performance pretty good with the particular settings that I had showcased early on. So it's looking like Lords of the Fallen, even though it is a pretty heavy game, is running decently well with the latest AMD APU. Pretty cool to see. If this is something that checks all the boxes for you, there's two different angles that you can look at this, right? You can look at this through the lens of, is this something that you're going to want for, say, when SteamOS has general compatibility, where you can just install SteamOS on this and have a PC game console for your living room? This is something that you may want to look into, because it's going to be something that's along the Steam Deck, but have a little bit more juice that you'd be able to push it a little bit further, as well as having 32 gigs of RAM is going to be in a better position to compensate for a lot of different games and not having to worry about running out of RAM so much. If you were looking at this from the avenue of using it for CPU compute, that is also something that is fairly compelling. When we take a look at it from the power perspective, you're only going to be pulling around 80 to 90 watts from the wall on this, so fairly low power from a general computing platform as a desktop. CPU-wise, again, benchmark-wise, we're taking a look at something that is comparable to the 1950X, a 16-core part. So even though we have 8 cores and we're using significantly less power compared to that platform, we are competing with that almost like for like in terms of general performance. So if you were looking for something that had enough CPU oomph, this is going to handle it for you as well. So those are the two kind of use cases that I see for it. This is for people that are very, very conscious of how much space this is on. Obviously, you can also do something like a VESA mount if you wanted to hook this up behind your monitor so that everything looks kind of invisible and you can't really see any wires going anywhere. This is going to be one solution that you're going to be looking at. And overall, Beelink did an excellent job, especially when we take a look at it from thermals and pushing that much power and not hearing anything and being able to handle that power, that workload through here, and not having to worry about thermally throttling. So that's it from me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.